Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I'm your co-host, Adeola Adejobi.
And I'm Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association. The MBBA is the largest association of predominantly African-American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers.
The goal of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a substantive conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process.
Today, we're going to discuss holding prosecutors accountable for their actions. Joining us now are Jullian Harris-Calvin and Diane Lucas, both senior legal counsel at the Justice Collaborative. Well, thank you both, Jullian and Diane, for joining us today on this important topic about how we can hold prosecutors accountable. So before we get into some of the weeds, Jullian, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what a prosecutor is and what exactly the role of that position is?
Sure. So the prosecutor is the chief law enforcement officer in every jurisdiction, whether it's city, county, state, or federally. For example, federally, Attorney General Barr is the head prosecutor, as we know, and he is the chief law enforcement officer for the entire country, federally. And they're responsible for all the prosecutions in a particular jurisdiction, whatever their jurisdiction is. And one of the problems with the way the prosecutorial bar is set up is that about 79% are white and 95% are white and 79% are white men. And so they don't really reflect the demographics of the people that they are prosecuting and incarcerating in the various jurisdictions, because most of them who are being prosecuted and incarcerated are people of color, predominantly black and brown folks.
And so what specific power do they have?
So they have the power to order people's arrest, to make charging decisions, decisions not to charge people, decisions to convene a grand jury to investigate people, to direct investigations by other law enforcement like your police or sheriff's department, or federally, the FBI, the DEA, those other policing agencies. They can make determinations about what pleas to offer to folks who have been charged. They can determine whether or not they're asking for jail time. When they ask a judge what a person should be getting if they go to jail, they can make a decision about whether to divert a person from the criminal justice system into treatment, like mental health treatment or drug treatment or some other kind of programming that addresses the underlying causes of their offense. They can make pretty much every decision that affects a person's liberty and the collateral consequences around the case that's been brought against a person. For instance, if you're someone who might have an immigration consequence to the charge that you get, the prosecutor can determine whether or not they're going to charge you with something that has an immigration consequence versus, we don't want this person to get deported for this offense, so I'm going to decide as the prosecutor to charge you with something that is a lower level offense, and therefore ICE isn't going to come pick you up. Or for instance, ICE might come pick you up, but you have a better chance of beating the immigration case. And so they have a lot of power in an individual person's life, but also a community at large.
And if I could touch upon the community at large piece. So in addition to being able to make determinations about charges for individuals, they can make determinations about charges generally. So prosecutors can say, we're no longer going to prosecute marijuana, which we've seen happen here in New York City, where prosecutors have said, we're no longer going to prosecute low-level marijuana charges. Or in Boston, in Suffolk County, the DA there, Rachel Rollins, she has a list of 15 charges that she says, I am not going to charge, because these charges have a disparity in terms of enforcement. And black and brown people are predominantly policed and charged for these offenses. So this is petty theft, this is jump in the turnstile, cases like that. And so they have huge power to be able to say that we're no longer going to charge for these quality of life offenses when we see there's a racial disparity, and it's wasting resources. We could be using these resources to focus on more serious offenses, but more importantly, what are the driving factors that are bringing people to court in the first place, that are putting them in this very harmful system? It's usually substance abuse, mental health, lack of education. All these things are structural problems that prosecutors shouldn't be handling, police officers shouldn't be handling. They should be handled in the civil world. And prosecutors can say, you know what, this is not for us to do. Let's not even prosecute these cases.
Right. And so in terms of prosecutorial power, does each prosecutor have the individual can decide that they want to prosecute a certain thing or not, or is there a certain set of rules that has to be changed? I think the audience would want some background on how that works.
Yeah, so this is prosecutorial discretion. So the prosecutor has wide discretion to determine whether to charge a case or not, whether to not prosecute the whole swath of cases like that. So there's not a list that they have to follow. They get to use their discretion. This has been challenged, and there have been governors that have tried to challenge prosecutors' discretion when they are reform-minded and trying to reduce the number of people who are incarcerated for things they shouldn't be incarcerated for. Attorneys General have also done this as well. So there have been challenges to this discretion, but prosecutors do have that discretion.
Yeah.
And if I can just add, I think at a ground level, the prosecutor who is in the courtroom prosecuting an individual case usually doesn't have that kind of discretion, the kind of discretion to determine whether or not to charge you or to give you a particular plea or a myriad of decisions. It's usually higher up prosecutors in the office. So it's really the chief prosecutor in a jurisdiction who has that power and maybe middle management to make those individual determinations. But typically it's not the guy that you see in the courtroom when you're charged with a crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I guess the interesting thing is, and we've seen this with maybe some of the previous prosecutors, where they're talking about Eric Holder, when we're talking on the federal side, or even Ken Thompson, where it seems like sometimes, at least if there's someone who's at that senior level, indicates that they aren't going to move forward with prosecuting low-level nonviolent offenses or what have you, that they can be able to make some of those changes. But actually, that kind of goes into maybe what's the, really what I think maybe some of our viewers would like to know a little bit more about, like, why is the prosecutor's role so important?
So it's important because I think we've all been able to see, particularly over the past several decades with the tough on crime changes, the 90s crime bills that are all in the news now, I think, that what the prosecutor does in terms of deciding who to prosecute, how much to prosecute, and who to incarcerate as a part of that prosecution has decimated communities of color. They have the power to really inject a police state, in particular communities of color, to create inequality in a city or a county or a state or federally. And it has created this domino effect where we're seeing today that there have been predominantly black and brown men who have been pulled from their families, from their jobs, from educational opportunities, and they've left our communities in a place where we can see the real consequences and we can see the cycle that it's created. And so I think that is why we have this current wave of reform-minded prosecutors who have come about to say, we recognize the damage that we've done to individuals, we recognize the damage that we've done to communities, and we recognize that long sentences and tough on crime policies actually do not make communities safer based on the data from the past 20, 30 years. And so we're trying to find a way to not create that harm on the back end, but to try to find ways to prevent the crime on the front end, address rehabilitation, and even if you want to believe in the other theories of punishment in terms of why someone should be dragged into court, we want to make sure that we address what needs to be done without hurting the individual, without hurting the community, protecting public safety, and making sure that recidivism isn't a problem in the future. And I think we're really on a great path, and there are a lot of prosecutors who are driving that. And I think prosecutors have the power to drive it. We shouldn't have to wait for legislators to get votes and draft bills and redraft bills. An individual prosecutor can just make a policy decision. I can just say, I'm not, as Diane said, I'm not going to prosecute marijuana offenses, as we've seen, or I'm not going to seek the death penalty. And then it stops. And that the consequences that run from that are then prevented on one person's decision, and it affects thousands, even hundreds of thousands, depending on the size of the jurisdiction.
And just to add to that, here in New York City, only 1% of criminal cases go to trial and end in a verdict. So what does that mean? That means prosecutors are pretty much end up being the jury or the judge, because they're the ones who determine what somebody's sentence is going to be, whether to offer them a plea that would give them a lesser sentence or not, whether to dismiss the case. And so we have so much power in the hands of prosecutors, and people envision the system as being one in which you have a trial by the jury of your peers. But so few people have that. And the reasons they don't have the opportunity to have a trial is because there's such a huge backlog in the courts. And also, prosecutors have contributed to this delay, where they have said that they're ready for trial and they're actually not ready, and then the case gets adjourned over and over. And so this is really important, because when you think about the vast majority of people who are facing a criminal offense who will never have a jury decide their fate, and we're relying on prosecutors to say, you know what, this case should be dismissed. And in fact, in 2017, 20% of cases were dismissed. And this, of course, takes months, years. If the prosecutor at the front end was like, hey, we're not going to prosecute these cases because we see that there's no value in this for as a society for us to be prosecuting this as criminal offenses, and we're just going to dismiss this on the front end, those 20% of people, which amounted to 51,000 plus people in New York City, those people would not have been so brutally harmed by the system, as Jullian pointed out. It's a horrible experience to be arrested, to go to jail, to be separated from your family. You could lose your job. You can lose benefits. Your kids could be taken away from you. And these are very, very real consequences that prosecutor has the power to completely avoid. So it's really, really important that we hold them accountable, and that we know their power. That's part of the accountability, is public education, because most people don't know.
Right, yeah, and just the fact that, I mean, while the case is going on, I mean, if you can't afford bail, you know, you're sitting there in jail this whole time.
Yeah.
And let's say you have, let's say you have some mental health challenges and you're not getting the prescription or what you need, to move on. Or let's say you have kids, right? And you need to make sure that those kids are being taken care of. It's funny because I've always heard that one of the, when people talk about who the most important person in the room is, or like in a courtroom, when we're talking about a case, you're thinking the judge, you're thinking the criminal defense attorney, but as you guys are saying, a lot of times it's really the prosecutor, because the prosecutor gets to decide, what cases to move forward with and whether or not they wanted to dismiss the charges.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually on the back end, they have power too, because let's say you've finished your sentence and you're on supervised release, or you didn't have a sentence, you just had probation, they can make a determination about whether or not to go back to court and ask the judge to put you in jail on a violation, whether it's something simple like, I was late or I missed a meeting with my probation or parole officer, or something like, I took some CBD and I got noticed in my drug test, and people sometimes have various reasons that are real life reasons why they might have missed an appointment or dropped out of drug treatment, or the many other technical violations. And it's the prosecutor's discretion to say, that was something that I can empathize with, and I understand childcare issues, and therefore I'm not going to try to seek jail now and revocation of your probation now because of this thing. It really affects people long term, even after their jail time is done, and it could keep people in a continuous cycle for years after you would expect someone not to be dealing with the criminal justice system.
Can you talk about the impact of having prosecutors of color? Because a lot of these cases happen in Black and brown communities, but there aren't that many Black and brown prosecutors.
Yeah, I think a big part of it, obviously, it's policy, right? You would hope that Black and brown prosecutors who are familiar with the communities that the vast majority of people who are accused of crimes are from would have more understanding and would implement policies that would be less carceral, because they would be more likely, just statistically speaking, to have a family member or a friend who has been a victim of the mass incarceration system. And so hopefully what they would implement policies that would be less carceral, that would focus more on rehabilitation, focus on alternatives to incarceration. So that's one aspect. And there's another very powerful aspect of having someone who looks like you in the room. When you are accused of a crime and you are brought to court after spending the night in jail, and you are a young black man and everyone in the courtroom is white, you're going to have a lot of distrust in the system that you already have a lot of distrust in, but even more distrust. But at least if you see a prosecutor who looks like you, and hopefully is also saying the right things and doing the right things, then you have a lot more trust in the system. And these are elected officials. They should represent the people they're representing. They should be reflective of the diverse population. And as Jullian said, they're not. And so there's so much power in having more people of color be prosecutors. And we're finding that among the reform-minded prosecutors, the majority of them are black women and black people in general and brown people as well. And so we are finding that they understand that this is a crisis that is affecting people of color, and they're stepping up because they want to be part of the change.
So when we're talking about, you had mentioned reform-minded prosecutors. Sometimes I feel like, especially like in New York, it may seem like it's becoming more reform-minded, or maybe it isn't. But I just know that we recently there's the Queens district attorney race, and I grew up in Queens, and one of the things that was interesting to me is all the folks who were, or just about everyone who was running, they were all talking about reform-minded issues, almost as if they're running to be the criminal defense attorney in some type of ways, which I think is good. Is that something that you're seeing is this a phenomenon here in New York, or is this something that you're seeing is kind of more national? I mean, what are your thoughts on whether or not we're going to be seeing more reform-minded prosecutors?
I think there is a nationwide wave of reform-minded prosecutors, and in fact, there was a public defender in Queens who ran, Tiffany Caban,
right.
and almost won,
Right.
which, given Queens, the history of Queens in terms of their electoral politics, that's a huge shift from 15, 20 years ago. Right. And it's happening everywhere. For instance, a public defender was recently elected to be the San Francisco district attorney. He's a former public defender. He's someone whose both of his parents were incarcerated for a long time. And these are major jurisdictions. These are huge cities. And it's happening in large and small jurisdictions across the country. And so it's not an anomaly. It's happening everywhere. Baltimore and Chicago, Boston, Philly, definitely with Larry Krasner. It's everywhere, and long-term DAs are getting real challenges, and they're real. Excuse me, and the wave is really growing because the electorate, right, the people on the ground, the voters, are calling for it, and that's really phenomenal. These are people who aren't necessarily personally affected by the criminal justice system, but they vote and they care about what's going on in their communities, even if it's not them personally or their families. And I think that's really a credit to our system, and it's really a credit to the American population, really, because these individuals are not doing it on their own.
Right. Yeah. And if I could just speak to the shift, the very dramatic shift we've seen just in Queens alone. So before this election that just happened, the DA, Richard Brown, was in office since 1991, unopposed. He has not been challenged since then. And if you think about it, most people, including me, I'm from Queens. When I was younger, I wasn't paying attention to the Queens district attorney election. And this has been a huge shift because now people care. And presidential candidates are endorsing local district attorney candidates. That's huge. And just the common New Yorker knew what was going on in Queens, even if they didn't live in Queens. And this is what we want, and this is what's happening. And what ends up happening is that there's this huge pressure on candidates who are not reform-minded to get on board and to be reform-minded because it's seen as the new sexy thing. And to our advantage, the new sexy thing happens to be something that we need for justice. We need to end mass incarceration and to help mitigate our deeply, deeply flawed, racially biased system that hurts so many people.
Right. How frequently are they elected?
So most terms are 4 years. It may vary by jurisdiction. And oftentimes they're run unopposed, as I was saying. So if they run unopposed, then you'd have to wait again for another 4 years for the election.
I just asked that because if the trend now is for people to push towards being a prosecutor that's about reform and things like that, and they're elected, but then they don't do what they say they're going to do, then I was just wondering when the next opportunity for the community to vote for someone else.
And what we're seeing to that point is that advocates and community members are one pushing for these people to be elected, but also on the back end, they don't just walk away, right? On the back end, they're holding them accountable to what you said as your platform, what you said at these 1,000,001 debates that we are seeing before the election. And they're holding them accountable. The media is a huge benefit to holding people accountable. Editorial boards are holding them accountable. Individual journalists are holding them accountable. Op-ed writers who are often members of the community or part of these advocacy groups that were pushing for reform. So it doesn't stop at the election, and we're seeing that. And so if on day one or day two you roll back from that day through the next election, these community groups are really making sure that everyone knows that you're a liar.
And even to that point, I think maybe it's a little too early to see just yet, but I know like when I was growing up, a person who is like Robert Morgenthau was the district attorney for decades, right? Same thing with Charlie Hines, who was there for a long time in Kings County, Robert Johnson in Bronx County, Richard Brown again in Queens. We've seen folks, it seems like for a long time, people who are prosecutors have been in that role and run unopposed for a very long time. Now we seem to have this new crop of folks who are the district attorneys. Do you think that, and especially as we're talking about accountability, do you think it's still going to be the same where the folks who are the prosecutors now are going to be in that role for a long time? Or do you think it's going to be something that's going to be more cyclical like we see with other elected offices where someone may be there for X amount of time, but then someone else can come in? Because I feel like that could play a big role in how we hold folks accountable. But if people stay there just, with their power unchecked, how do we wrap our minds around that?
I think that's really yet to be seen. I think, as Diane was mentioning, we have these very strong and entrenched law enforcement and prosecutorial associations who are doing a lot of fear-mongering. We all remember the Willie Horton situation, and that is a tactic that they're continuing to use both nationally and locally. And so it really is up to folks like us, community members, the media particularly, to push back on these individual incidents where there's hyperbole and fear-mongering around a particular crime that took place because someone once was incarcerated and got out this one time, and really take a bigger picture look and see that the data supports what is happening. This is fact-based, evidence-based reform that's happening. And we have to keep that in mind and not get sucked in and blinded by this fear-mongering. And it's loud, and it's these associations that have really strong ties with legislatures and also with the media, some aspects of the media. So it is really, I think, yet to be seen, particularly in those really small, more conservative places or more tough on crime places where this is really a huge sea change from anything they've ever seen. I think in New York it's a sea change, but it's New York, right? And San Francisco, it's San Francisco. But there are people who are really fighting against this huge backlash in these smaller jurisdictions. And it's there where we'll see how long lasting this is.
Yeah, I guess another thing that also comes to mind as you talk about some of these smaller jurisdictions is, what do we do when someone, for example, is being prosecuted upstate New York, where they may not have, for example, the Justice Collaborative or some of the other progressive or reform-minded nonprofit organizations, have a strong presence there. Like, how do we hold prosecutors accountable in areas where, we see some of these issues?
Yeah, so the Justice Collaborative actually works nationally, and we are looking for mostly the big jurisdictions where you have the most impact, right? But we are also looking at the smaller jurisdictions as well. And attention is the biggest thing, because to your point, these smaller communities, no one's paying attention to district attorney elections, even now when it's a sexy thing that people are more interested in. It just, only people in that small community are paying attention, which means that the elected official, the prosecutor, doesn't feel like they need to be accountable. And so the more attention that we could pour into those communities or have in those communities and resources we can pour into that community, the better. There are other national organizations that are financing, supporting campaigns by reform-minded candidates, and they're actually supporting them all over the country, even in small towns. And I think that's going to be the big difference, where people who haven't thought that I should run, but you have this well-funded organization that is going to support your campaign financially because of your policies, because you are reform-minded. That's encouraging a lot of people to run in smaller jurisdictions, people going back to where they're from urban communities to rural communities, to run. And that's where you're going to see the difference. But right now, to your point, it's still really in the dark ages in a lot of the smaller communities, where asking a prosecutor to not prosecute low-level marijuana, that's par for the course. Like, that's standard in most big cities now. But you have lots of small jurisdictions where that's incredibly controversial. And there are people who are actually sitting in jail and prisons for marijuana possession when there are whole states that have it legalized. So there's lots of room for work in those areas.
And that's great. So that's all the time that we have. Thank you so much for coming. There's so much more that we could have talked about today. And we want to thank you all for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA on the Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Goodbye.
See you next time.